Andreas Rasche. So the question is whether you can summarize the outcome of the Omnibus, but also your evaluation so far, and whether you agree with the assessment that this is a unique turning point, and why.
Thank you very much indeed, Onna, and thanks for inviting me, David, and thanks for moderating, Onna. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and to discuss this with you. In order to answer your question, we agreed that I will share some slides, which I will do just now, and I hope everybody can see them, in order to kind of give you an update on where we stand, what was decided. Onna, you mentioned it. This final agreement came about just right before Christmas. It's important to state, co-reaper in the Council, the Committee of Permanent Representatives, as well as the Parliament have signed off on this. So it is a done deal. What was agreed? Well, I think maybe a bit of background is necessary. We face here the first omnibus package. So far, the European Union, or the Commission rather, has launched 10 of them. All of these 10 packages aim at regulatory simplification in some sort of the other. Omnibus 1, which we are discussing here today, was concerned with sustainability. It actually included 4 different types of regulations: the CSRD, reporting, CSDD, due diligence, taxonomy, as well as CBAM. Taxonomy was not open directly. Taxonomy was open through the Delegated Act and the CSRD and CSDD. It's a bit of technical details here. My overall assessment is I mean, it is clear. We have lost quite a bit of the European accountability infrastructure, I would say. And this is mostly due to the first point here on the slide, the enormous reduction in scope. So for the CSRD, the new scope is set at 1,000 full-time employees, plus 450 million turnover. This, I will show you in a minute, puts roughly 4,800 companies within Europe in scope, which is a 90% reduction, 90, which is very, very significant. Yeah, if you de-scope 90% of companies from a directive, then of course you need to ask yourself how much simplification is in this and how much deregulation. For the CSDD, we have a 70% reduction, which is still very significant. And we have a review clause in the final agreement that means these scope criteria will be revisited, but it will be a couple of years, 3-4 years, until this is being done. So this is something for the future. The message that the EU sends here is the delay and sustainability reporting and due diligence is something for the very big firms. Transition plans have been deleted in CSDD, the climate transition plans. They have been retained in CSRD. I talked to some legal scholars recently. They say, that's a bit tricky, and we are looking into this, how exactly to kind of interpret this. Important here is the CSDD actually had the implementation obligations, the CSRD just the reporting obligations. So strictly speaking, you face reporting obligations without implementation obligations. And there is, of course, we all know this, a risk for greenwashing. Due diligence, here the EU has decided to have, they call it themselves, the full risk-based approach. How full this is remains up for debate, I would say. There are a number of exceptions. For instance, if you have several adverse impacts at the same time, you can kind of prioritize yourself. So there is quite a bit of flexibility built into the system. And of course, the kind of deletion of civil liability, what we had before the Omnibus was for the due diligence law, an EU-wide uniform civil liability standard. This has now been replaced by 27 different national standards. And of course, a lot of people say, where's the simplification in that? It makes things really more complicated, also in terms of liability costs for companies. So I think it is important to avoid misinterpretation and overreaction. There was a lot of heated debate around the Omnibus. Also politically speaking, some of you might remember the EPP voted together with the far right on this because there was no compromise among the center parties. Nevertheless, the rollback does not change physical realities. I think it might sound like a mundane and obvious point, but it is an important point to make. because at the end of the day, climate change, biodiversity loss, they don't care whether we deregulate or not. The stakeholder expectations, for instance, on businesses, they remain the same, even when we deregulate. It still trickles down. The CSRD has a value chain cap, but the value chain cap says, well, you can ask all information that are included in the VSME, the voluntary SME standard. And these are still some basic information. So you cannot simply walk away as a small and medium-sized enterprise, because you still need to kind of have basic data available if you are asked for this data, for instance, by banks or business partners. And as I said earlier, climate transition plans deleted. That's tricky. The challenge here will be to provide consistency and avoid liability risks. Of course, most companies will, when they report on these plans, probably also have some sort of implementation practices attached to them. But the behavioral standards that were fixed actually in the CSRD, they have been deleted. Our calculations, I worked with a team on this throughout last year. This is Orbis data, so Moody's Orbis data. So roughly 4,800 firms in scope of CSRD. You see, originally it was 46,000 roughly. What I would criticize here quite a bit, and that's why I say it's a loss also of accountability, we really go even beyond NFRD thresholds. So the NFRD threshold, of course, was 500 public interest entities. You roughly had 11,700 firms in scope of NFRD. Now we go much below this. So regulatory consistency has taken a significant hit. By the way, this was also significantly criticized by the European Central Bank, who said this should be our bottom line. We shouldn't go below that. Because we need to ensure some sort of regulatory consistency. So practically speaking, you face some companies that have been reporting for a number of years now who suddenly have no legal obligation anymore to do that. And that's, of course, the big question for the future. On the reporting side in particular, something that I'm working on at the moment also right now. What will these firms do? What happens to the roughly 42,000 companies that have been de-scoped, exempted? How will they report in the future if they report voluntarily? I think there are different pillars here, different approaches. The larger companies in this bandwidth between 250 and 1,000 employees, I think they will probably go for some sort of revised ESRS standard, because the VSME, the standard for the kind of SMEs that is voluntary, this doesn't cut it for them. I had some conversations here with Danish companies where this became quite apparent, where the companies said, look, I mean, we've been doing this for a number of years now. We cannot kind of now go for the VSME standard. That's too simple for us. I mean, the VSME standard doesn't even have a double materiality assessment obligation. So that wouldn't cut it for these kind of firms. Then you have a large chunk of firms that will probably adopt VSME is, of course, a possibility. The standard will come in mid-2026. The Commission has said it will not make any significant revisions to the standard to kind of make it more proportionate to company size, so that will not happen. However, these companies probably might also go for GRI, ISSB. There are many possibilities here. My personal concern here is we might see fragmentation, more fragmentation in the field, and that, of course, is not good because that increases also coordination costs also on the investor side. And then finally, you will have quite a bit of companies that do what I call here bilateral disclosures. These are the companies that, you know, they are asked by their bank when they take out a loan for emissions data, and they will have to respond somehow. They might not fulfill full reporting obligations. They might not issue a report, but what they will do is they will probably pass on this data to the bank or to the investor or to the business partner. So in this sense, this bilateral disclosures really is more reactive and ad hoc. And overall, I think we are moving towards this smart compliance paradigm. Companies that have been de-scoped through the Omnibus, they need to ask themselves, what are the expectations? What are our own values? And what are the value drivers, right? What does reporting and due diligence do for me? Does it help me, for instance, to identify risks and opportunities? And I would count this into value drivers. So I'm pushing quite a bit for the smart compliance paradigm. I'm developing this with different people right now, where we kind of say, legal compliance, of course, is not everything. And these companies that have been descoped, they will also not just walk away, but we need to understand what shapes their decisions. And this is, I think, the starting point, at least for me. With this, thank you very much. And I stop here and I hand it back to you, Onna.
Great, thank you so much. I want to ask two clarification questions which came from the audience. One is, so we know that some firms have been descoped and also that there has been an implementation delay, but has the content of the regulation changed as well? And another question, I think, which goes more to your second last slide, you said, well, there will be these proactive firms still. Is that an advisable thing to do in the current climate?
Thank you. First question, yes, the content of the regulation has changed as well. It's not just the scope. In the EU, we distinguish level 1 and level 2 regulation. So at level 2, you usually have the technical standards, and the technical standards for the CSRD are the so-called ESRS, so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. They have been revised as well. Reduction of data points of 70%, so significantly, but also the directives themselves have been changed. For instance, the climate transition plans were deleted, the value chain caps were introduced. So there were a number of changes there. Of course, the basic idea of the directives is still there. And that's important to say, right? That's important to say. The basic idea of reporting and due diligence is still there. The difference is it just applies to much fewer companies. Second question, is it advisable? Short answer, yes. It is. I would say so because the market pressures are there. We know this from surveys. Business partners want this data, banks want this data. And this is what I meant a little bit with the risks don't go away. I was recently on a panel with somebody from a large Danish bank, and she said, look, climate risks are real for us. And it doesn't matter whether, these things are changed now in regulations. We will still ask for this kind of data because we need it and we want it. So in this sense, I think it is advisable to go down this route. What kind of level you choose yourself, right? In terms of reporting, I think this is, of course, up for debate.
Great. And maybe one last question before I hand it over to David. What is your current expectation for non-EU entities?
Non-EU entities have been not as much descoped as some thought originally. If you look into the major indices, for instance, Nikkei or the MSCI or the S&P, the number of companies, for instance, that need to report according to CSRD have decreased a bit, but not as much. The EU has changed a bit the scope criteria, for instance, for non-EU companies in the CSRD. The net turnover threshold was put to 450 million on EU markets. So it goes down a bit, but not significantly. And I think it is important, even though the EU gets and got a lot of geopolitical pressure on this by the Trump administration, that they stay course and preserve the extraterritorial elements in these regulations. This is absolutely key because we need a level playing field. Companies that sell significantly on European markets, they should also need to follow European legislation.
Great. Great. So I know that there is one more question, but in the interest of time, I'm going to hand it over to David. David, you wrote this great book where you give also a longer term overview, and you talk about the lessons from failure and success of EU corporate accountability regulation. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Thank you, Anna. Okay, I'm gonna just follow up by sharing some slides quickly. So hopefully you can see them. Well, this is a bit like the idiosyncrasy that we are in at the moment. So in 2023, the commissioner was presenting what we are the standards for sustainability reporting as the right balance, a good compromise. And then we see 2 years later we are, and I think it's quite interesting the wording that they choose. So that we are freeing from a very burdensome reporting requirements. Now, you have to understand that this is the same end that created those rules and then decided that they were too burdensome and they were actually freeing company from them. So at this point in time, I was tasked to write a book, which is the one that you mentioned. This book was supposed to be the triumph of sustainability reporting. Finally, after so many years of fight, we got 50,000 companies. Everything is rosy in the future, and we have a strong regulation. Obviously, while I was writing this book, this needed to change. So what happened was a bit of what we do as academic, trying to use this research to almost as a therapeutical exercise in which you try to make sense of what's going on around you. And of course, this major disappointment for so many of us, which has been the Omnibus process. So what I've been asking myself is what explain these struggles, this recursive regulatory capture, this weak regulatory outcome that keep happening. Because the first thing that came to my mind is I've seen this before. This is not the first time that there's something like this happen at the European level. So if you look at this very quickly, obviously you can read the book if you want, or I cannot go into the detail, but I think I want just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. So this is actually a declaration that could be written today about harmonizing, need to harmonize this information, need to lack of harmonization, but this was the European Commission asking in 2001 to have harmonized standards. If we go further in time, we have a very similar declaration. The disclosure, the transparency is progressing very slowly. We need to have better information. But that was, again, in 2013, when we have the non-financial reporting directive. The non-financial reporting directive eventually wasn't that effective in doing what we were supposed to do, because in fact, we have, again, the same question. Do we have good information? The answer is no. We have many voluntary options, and the voluntary options are not good enough. So as Andrea said, we are kind of going back to voluntary solution, while we know very well that the voluntary solution is not going to work. We know that investors want this information, trade unions, NGOs, there is a large number of users of this information, and the information are not there. And that was in 2020. What is interesting is the person that is saying that is the same person, Dombrovskis, that was actually saying that this is a very burdensome regulation. So this is the situation in which we are, and we need to unpack a little bit this. So my take is this is a particularly embarrassing U-turn that the European Commission did, but it's not the first one, okay? So while this may be particularly painful, but we have to understand the structural problem that are leading towards this regulatory capture, effectively, that is happening and happening again and again. So we are in this Groundhog Day, which is particularly annoying, but I see this more as a positive and as a negative. It means that actually this question is keep coming back. The negative is why we are not achieving what we need to achieve on this. And on this, there are two perspectives that I think are both correct to some extent, but not, kind of polarizing the debate. One is saying we need information. If we get information, then the market is going to process this, and magically, through transparency, we're going to have sustainability. And the second one is saying actions are louder than words. We don't actually need, too much disclosure. This is a waste of time and resources. What we need is action. And what I'm suggesting is something in between. And, again, I think we need to reflect very deeply into this sort of dynamics. And I'm going back to Weber, Max Weber, Sombart, the really original thinkers about capitalism. And they were saying that accounting is actually what created capitalism. Now, we could talk a lot about this, but this sort of train of thought has been lost over time. Without capital, we wouldn't have capitalism. Without accounting, we wouldn't have capital. If we don't measure this in a certain way. This has been, said by a minority, if you want, of accountants, scholars, economists, quite often, that, accounting has this organizing, economizing, very powerful role. And I think we treat in accounting too much as a secondary, mechanical process, and we don't understand the political economy of accounting, and I would say the political ecology of accounting, more recently. So we need to, ask ourselves, and this is a big question that I'm gonna ask, I'm not gonna address today, but we may even ask ourselves, is actually our obsession for growth coming from accounting, from the fact that actually we measure things in a certain way? We are doing the race on financial, basically, success. And this is the reason why there is the current and very damaging obsession on a certain way of growing. So the argument basically is that we have a structural fallacy in the design of the research of the regulation system, because we have a very restrictive view of accounting that emerged between the 1980s and the 2000s, only focused on financial accounting for investors. And this is creating two things. One is a very predatory approach to value capture, and this has been discussed many times. And the second thing is that anything related to society or the environment are treated as externalities, are treated as extraneous. So the result has been that actually we have sustainability reporting as an add-on to financial reporting, rather than transforming financial reporting, which is what we need to do. We add something called sustainability reporting, which is not really, redefining what is the fundamentals. So I would suggest, the real problem is all good, to have this sustainability reporting is better than nothing, but the real issue, and I think this is the, also very consequential for our debate about sustainability and accountability of corporation, is something that this slide, I think, explained really clearly. We can see sustainability reporting, but this is looking at the finger. It's not looking at the moon. The moon is financial reporting, and understanding exactly to what extent, and there are very few research that are doing this, to what extent financial reporting is actually exacerbating climate change, exacerbating the sustainability crisis we are in. So to do this, I did something called a double historicization, which is basically looking at not just the concept, also how we construct the concept. In particular, I've been looking at the idea that the economy and accounting have been created together. They are what Bourdieu would call two fields that are linked to each other, and he called it a legitimate imposture, which I think is very interesting. So they basically are coming together and evolving together. And if you do that, and if you consider the history of sustainability reporting together with the history of financial reporting, then everything becomes much more clear. So sustainability reporting emerged the first time in the 1960s, and it was all about workers and employees, and what was basically the reporting on the social aspect, if you want. And then it ended on January 1980s, we end up this debate. It was a very prominent debate until the 1980s in Europe about making mandatory information for trade unions, for workers, and it ended up very, very suddenly. And it ended up while actually we were harmonizing financial reporting, and we adopted IFRS, and we adopted a very narrow idea about what reporting of corporations should be, which become very investor-centered, very neoliberal, and very narrow in that sense. In the 2010, and with the financial crisis, we see this double crisis, the socio-ecological crisis and the financial crisis. Together with this, there was a very clear challenge of financial accounting as it is, and the damaging effect on society. And in fact, this is leading towards the harmonization of mandatory sustainability reporting, which is the point we are now on time. Obviously, in the book, this is developed much further, but just to give an idea of the two things. So I'm gonna almost finish with this. So we better understand sustainability reporting if we understand financial reporting as well. And the development of both, I think, is very related. It's not by chance that now we have like the IFRS Foundation, which is developing their own sustainability reporting, and there is a big movement around what is the change, not just in sustainability reporting, but also in general with reporting. What I think is really interesting is to go back to the work of Hopwood or Miller, that were saying that actually accounting is a craft with no essence. So we can do whatever we want with accounting. And I think we have to understand that accounting can be a very strong tool for sustainability as well. But also we have to understand sustainability reporting as coming from the margin. There is a beautiful article by Miller that says accounting has been always formed and reformed at the margins. And I think sustainability reporting is this request for changing financial reporting, accounting in general, from the margin in order to take into account socio-ecological issues that we are facing at the moment. What is happening at the moment with the European regulation is not this. The European regulation is basically here. It shows that sustainability reporting has to be as good as financial reporting. But financial reporting is not the standard, it's not the golden standard that we should follow. The ISSB want to have actually sustainability reporting as a sub part of financial reporting. I think what we need to have is sustainability as a broader goal for changes, as a principle for financial reporting, which is where we need to add to. Thank you so much, and I hope it was understandable and interesting. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, David. It's always good to hear an accountant being an accounting scholar being critical of their own discipline. So we've heard a lot from both of you in terms of where we are, where we're going to, what this all means, and trying to make sense of the landscape. So what I want to ask next to both of you, and maybe Andreas, you can start, what possible exciting research questions should we pay attention to in this post-Omnibus research agenda?
I think there are loads of very good research questions. I think a lot of them, for me, circle around the voluntary nature of reporting, because voluntary reporting after the Omnibus is different than voluntary reporting before the Omnibus, because you now have different market expectations. The CSRD, in its original form, had done something to the market. It had kind of created performative effects, so to say. And I think this is something that we now need to be aware of. How do companies react to this, right? And I think these are very straightforward questions, and I would also encourage all colleagues, let's also treat them as straightforward questions. What do firms do? What do the 42,000 firms that have been descoped do? And from first interviews that we do here, or that we've done here in Denmark, we see a lot of different approaches out there. So this is something I think worth looking into. Another research area is, I think, the entire institutional and political context of this. What has happened here at the EU? What made the EU decide to really turn their back, almost, I must say, on sustainability reporting and to devalue it so much? So I think that this is something that we need to look closer into, because also we didn't discuss it so far in this webinar, but the entire process of the Omnibus was highly problematic. The Commission proposal has no impact assessment attached to it. There was very limited consultation. Also, the interagency consultation at the Commission was very limited. And all of this throws up questions of accountability. And I think this is something that also we as researchers need to look into.
Great. What do you think, David?
No, I agree with this. I think, there are so many interesting research questions that are going around at the moment. One question which is aligned also with what Andreas was suggesting is about values, but sometimes we think about values too much on a personal level. And I think also the tradition of pragmatism around understanding these more broadly as a public issue, I think is very important. So what is happening at the European level, which I think to some extent is also explaining what's happening with the Omnibus, is that the European project is becoming more loaded with normative issues because of China, because of the US. So we are really searching from our soul in a way, trying to understand what is Europe about. And there are clearly two propositions on the table, I think, at the moment internationally. One is the fact that, and they are both related with the same question. So how we can deal with the planet that has limited resources. And the first answer is we have hemispheric security landlords, which is what Trump and China is suggesting. So we are stronger and we're gonna get what we want. The other answer is I think the European Union has to be leading this other answer, which is we can there is a space for a just and safe human future, because this is the way forward. And I think a lot of the question that we've seen is around this. One thing that I'm really interested in is also the role of activists. So Andreas rightly said we need to have voluntary. We need to understand to what extent companies how they will react. I think the concept of internal activists is really interesting in this. How people within companies will mobilize, and with consultants and accountants and lawyers, will mobilize in order to move this forward. The last thing is I've been talking to companies, and briefly when actually the original CSRD was applied, I've seen a lot of conversation within companies, very, very interesting debates about what is the relation between the financial and the sustainability within climate and sort of the bottom line. And I think this is going to keep happening, this sort of conversation about what is how we can change companies from within in order to make sense of this crisis from a perspective of a company. And I agree I'm quite optimistic actually that we put a foot on the door anyway, and something, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 6 years, we're going to reopen this and expand the scope of this legislation, because the question is still there.
Great. And I think if we think about more even the global debates and the sustainability agenda becoming more polarized, and this is a question I want to ask to you, Andreas. For those regulators that are still committed to the sustainability agenda, what type of research can we put forward that helps them drive it into a future? And do you think we might still be able to create a turn of the tides here in terms of the sustainability agenda?
I think what would help at the moment, the EU institutions, is research that helps them to frame sustainability legislation in the way that they frame it. Because they have started to, if you read the proposals that are coming out these days, for instance, on the Industry Accelerator Act and so on, if you read these proposals, you kind of see that the EU has started to reframe the sustainability debate. We move away, from von der Leyen 1.0, where everything was about the Green Deal and, there were these big ambitions and so on. Sustainability now is a pillar that rests between geopolitics and competitiveness. And this is how the EU sees it. So what we need to, as researchers, what we need to support is we need to support with research that allows regulators also to frame regulations in that way. I give you an example. The new Circular Economy Act that is coming will likely have, it's not proposed yet, so that's why I need to kind of frame it carefully, will likely have, for instance, legislation on how to deal with the extraction of rare earths from e-waste. Why is this important? This is important for geopolitical reasons, because it decreases our dependencies on other regions that we currently have for rare earths. We are very, very dependent on China for rare earths. So in that sense, I think this is research, I think that is that is helpful. Of course, it is a little bit reactive, and that's why I would say a second pillar would be research that challenges the EU on this, whether they are really still on the right path. because just always adapting, they always argue, oh, we adapt to the geopolitical realities around us. And I think, David, you showed it very nicely with Dombrovskis, saying one thing, and then fast forward 4 years, he says almost the exact opposite. And I think a little bit consistency and integrity would actually do no harm here. So maybe, some research that also challenges legislators on this and pushes them a little bit is, I think, very much needed and probably also welcome.